We acknowledge that we are on Treaty 6 territory, the gathering grounds of many diverse First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples whose footsteps have marked this land and whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. Hello and welcome back to Research Recasted, the Knowledge Mobilization podcast. I'm your host, Brooklyn Listian, and today we are joined by Dr. Jessica Haines. Jess is a wildlife biologist whose research and teaching focuses on conservation, biology, and connecting others with the outdoors. She enjoys exploring wild places while hiking, hunting, and fishing, accompanied by her Labrador retrievers. Well, thank you for being with us today, Jess.
Thanks for having me.
We had a wonderful conversation before this about the squirrels in Calgary and more wildlife stuff. So I'm excited to talk today.
I'm looking forward to it as well.
Yeah. We're going to get you to start talking about your research with Franklin's ground squirrels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Franklin's ground squirrels is a ground squirrel species that lives in Alberta, and it looks like it's probably a declining species. So people, naturalists around the province basically flagged the species as probably being in trouble, which is what started my project actually on this. This project was actually started by Nature Alberta originally, who's my partner on this project. They're a nonprofit who focuses on conservation and education about nature. And so they started a community science project where they collected observations of this species. And then what I do is I take those observations and figure out where we can expect to find that's the species in the province. And then we're trying to confirm where they live, because some of those observations are older, so we're seeing if they're still there. And also to see if they're in other places in the province where they haven't been reported. Because one problem with a species that seems really common, if you're used to seeing it, is often people don't report them because they think they're doing fine. So it's a really good example of how if you take a look at nature and you're spending a lot of time in nature, submitting observations of those species that you're seeing is actually really important and really helpful for biologists like myself to use. But we also don't know if it exists outside provincial parks. So right now we're finding it primarily in provincial parks. And we're not sure if that's because that's where people hang out and that's thus where they're submitting observations of it, or if that's where the species actually exists. So that's one part of our research, is really trying to figure out where it is. We have a few other parts. We also are collecting genetic samples. So we went to the Royal Alberta Museum and we went to the University of Alberta Museum collection, and we collected some tissue samples from some of the specimens there. And those gave us historical samples for genetic analysis. And then we also collected genetic samples from the animals we were catching in the wild. So we would set up live traps that catch them without harming them, and we take mouth swabs, and we use that for our genetic sampling. And then the last thing we do is we depend on the public still. So this project started because of the public, and we're continuing to use the data that's generated by the public to help us learn more about this species. So we go to public outreach events that are organized by our partner, Nature Alberta, as well as others. We went to an open farm day this summer. So if you've never been to open farm days, really great way to meet the people that are producing our food. And we were lucky enough to actually be able to spend a day at one talking about squirrels to the people that were showing up to the farm. So those are really fun because we get to actually interact with the public and tell them about squirrels. And we actually created a squirrel ID guide that you can download for free. And that we hand those out at a lot of our events. So people really enjoy learning about all the 14 different species of squirrel that we have in the province and how to identify them. And then for me, it's also fun because a lot of those people spend time outside and have a lot to tell me about squirrels. And so it's both a learning opportunity for the public to learn from what we're finding out with squirrels, but it's also a learning opportunity for me to hear from members of the public that actually have experience with these species. And so I get to learn more from them as well. And then, of course, I have research students that get all this experience. So they get to come out in the field with me and do the data collection, and they also get to come out to these outreach events to help us talk to the public. And so they learn public outreach and public speaking skills. So really good overall for everyone that's involved.
That's really cool. We will link in the bio for the guide, Squirrel Guide. But what's kind of like the main difference of Franklin ground squirrels? Like, what makes them kind of different than what would our regular squirrel be before we compare?
Yeah, so really good question. It depends on where you are in the province, but one that a lot of people confuse it with is Richardson's ground squirrels. They're kind of your typical ground squirrel, which people also call gophers, that you would see like out in farm fields or really anywhere that there's open space. So that species is different from Franklin's because they live in really big populations. They are often in colonies. They are really good at living in places that humans disturb. So they love very heavily grazed areas. They love areas that people have cleared for their own purposes. I've seen them in parks and open areas that we've created. Franklin's, on the other hand, seem to be much more sensitive to humans. So Franklin's ground squirrels need dense vegetation, and they also seem to need areas that have food. So we are next year going to explore a bit more about what vegetation they need, so we can learn better how to help them out. But so far, I think that they likely need shrubs that are fruit producing, probably to help them beef up in time for hibernation, because they are a hibernating species. So that's why they're a little different than the gophers or Richardson's ground squirrels, because Richardson's ground squirrels really like people, and that's why they can be a bit of a pest. I've even seen them dig up through roads, dirt roads, and create holes in roads. They're well known for farmers are always worried about them in livestock areas because they don't want their livestock to twist one of their feet, one of their ankles. Whereas Franklin's, you won't see them out in the open except along the edges of open areas. We do see them come out to eat things like dandelions and other vegetation right on the edges, but they always want to be near dense brush. And we think that's probably why they're declining, because they need that really pristine habitat, those really pristine areas, and we just don't have a lot of those in Alberta anymore. So the area that they're most abundant in is called the parkland habitat in Alberta. The parkland region is basically the transition zone between the boreal forest to the north and the prairies to the south. And so it's the area that's around Edmonton and central Alberta. And that area has actually been changed quite significantly by humans. The Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute keeps stats on the impact of humans in different areas of the province, and almost 80% of parkland has been changed by humans.
Wow. Which
means if you have a species that's sensitive to that, then they have very little space left where they're able to actually survive. So that's one big difference between them. Now, if you want to actually tell Franklin's apart from other species, so the Richardson's ground squirrels are all kind of one color, usually kind of a tan color, although there is a little bit of color variation between different individuals. But whereas the Franklins have a gray head and a gray tail and kind of a reddish or brown body. And then a white underside. But the really gray tail and gray head is really distinctive. And they also have a really long tail compared to their body, especially compared to other types of ground squirrel species. They almost look like someone took a ground squirrel, like a gopher, and stuck a tree squirrel tail on it, because the tree squirrels are the ones that have the long fluffy tails. And so they're also distinctive from the tree squirrels, like red squirrels, which are ones you'd see around Edmonton or in forested areas, or the gray squirrels, which are the gray and black ones that are in Calgary. Those squirrels live in trees, which is why we call them tree squirrels, and they don't have that distinctive color pattern like we see on Franklin's. And then the other one that people sometimes get them confused with are Columbian ground squirrels, which is the species that lives in mountainous areas. So if you go to Banff or Jasper or any of those places to go hiking, then you're likely going to be seeing marmots and Columbian ground squirrels. The Columbian ground squirrels look similar to Franklin's in some ways, except they almost have the reverse color pattern, whereas instead of having an all gray head, they actually have red on their face instead of just on their back. So that's one way that you can tell them apart, is to look for the reddish bit on their nose, and they'll often have reddish feet as well. So a little bit of a different color pattern.
That's wild. I didn't realize that there were so many different kinds of squirrels. It makes me laugh because recently my parents have had many squirrels and gopher issues this summer, with my poor little lab. She is such a freak. They had squirrels in the camper, squirrels in the backyard, so that's funny. They'll get a kick out of that.
That's actually why I like working on squirrels, because no matter who I talk to, they have a squirrel story. It might be positive, it might be negative, but everyone can connect to that group of species because they're just so good at living around us that we just learn about them really easily. So yeah, I get all kinds of stories from, oh, they're my favorites, I have a family of them that lives in my backyard and eats at my bird feeder, to, oh, I hate them because they're always getting into my shed, or they're always causing damage, or oh, the gophers, the Richardsons, they're causing problems in my backyard. So I mean, I like that variation. Like I could meet anybody in those in any aspect of that like spectrum of opinions about squirrels, because it's totally understandable if you have something like a ground squirrel that is causing damage on your property, but still they're still really fun to learn about and still a really good species to have around.
And how to take care of the problem properly.
I mean, if you do have problem animals, I would say don't use poison. That's one thing that a lot of people will go to get rid of squirrels, especially ground squirrels. The problem with using poison is that it gets into the ecosystem, and when those animals die, they get eaten by predators and scavengers, and then that poison actually gets into the food chain. So if you're going to remove anything, then you could use live traps and translocate individuals. Check that it's legal where you are. There's different rules around pest species in different places. Or if you're going to euthanize them, then use a targeted method. So either a trap that you can live trap them and humanely euthanize them, or shooting is what I often hear from people in rural areas. So the people that are listening to this are from cities might think this is really weird, but if you're from a rural area, that's often how people control their populations. And as much as I love squirrels, I understand that sometimes there are ones that cause trouble, and I would much rather see an approach that's more humane and less likely to cause damage to the ecosystem. So please avoid poisons. That would be my main takeaway if you're having squirrel problems.
That's good advice. I want to touch on how they take mouth swabs from squirrels.
Yeah, so when I started this project, our first year of field data collection was last year. And I've worked with squirrels in the past. That's why I was excited to work with this species, to have a species that I could work with here in Alberta that might need some help. But when I've done that work in the past, we used ear tissue samples. So you would take a little biopsy punch, which if you've ever gotten a skin biopsy done at the doctor, it's the exact same punch that they use by human doctors. But we take that and we take a very tiny piece of ear tissue off the edge of their ear. Now, they don't really care too much about it. It heals really quickly. It's a very small piece of tissue, and it's, their ear is functional, but taking a little tiny bit off the edge shouldn't have any impact on its function. But still, I was looking for other ways to take samples that might be less invasive. Whenever I'm working with wildlife, I want to try and use the least invasive method possible to respect those animals and to reduce our impacts on them. Especially if we're working with a species that might be threatened with extinction, we especially in that case want to use the least invasive methods possible to work with them. So we also tried out hair samples where we plucked hairs from individuals, and we used the mouth swabs. So these are all from the same individuals. We take one sample of each method from each individual. The mouth swab sounds like it would be really challenging to stick a swab inside the mouth of a squirrel. But it was actually way easier than I was expecting. The other things we did, like putting in an ear tag, so we put ear tags in so that we can identify them, and also so we don't double trap individuals and try and reduce our impact on those individuals. So if we didn't put ear tags in, we could potentially just catch the same individual over and over and over again, which we don't want to do. So we're doing all of that, and they protest to all of that because they want to go out and they want to be let go and go eat. They're obsessed about eating because they are always trying to bulk up. But when we did the mouth swab, they just usually freeze and just sit there. Like, humans are very strange animals. So yeah, they just sit there and let us do the mouth swab. So the way it works, we buy these swabs that are either for taking DNA samples, such as from dogs or people. If you've ever gotten a DNA sample taken yourself or taken one from your pet, you probably have seen these mouth swabs where you just swab the inside of your cheek. That's the exact same thing we're doing with the squirrels. We also tested out this year some swabs that were actually just dental brushes that you buy from the grocery store. So they're brushes you can get to help you floss, essentially. And they're small and they have a little bunch of bristles on the end of them. So they all worked about the same. So the nice thing about the brushes we got from the store is that they're really easy to buy. We can just go to the store and buy them instead of ordering them special. So we take those different brushes, we take one at a time, obviously not a bunch at once, but we take one brush and we have the squirrel immobilized either just with a leather glove or in a handling bag, depending on the individual and how they're responding to our handling. And then we just stick the swab on the inside of their cheek. And it sounds really hard, but it's not. It's actually really easy, and I've been pleasantly surprised. So after testing all these different methods, that's the one that we've decided to go with. It works well. We get enough DNA for our purposes, and it's non-invasive, so we're not removing anything from the squirrel. And the squirrels really don't seem to care too much about it. They're less annoyed about that. Out of all the things we do, that seems to be the thing that bothers them the least. So it's been really fun to apply that new method to this year in the field.
Out of all aspects of your research, what is the most challenging part?
Probably catching them in the first place. Because we're working in provincial parks, there are some limits to where we can work. We can't trap right in the middle of a campground. We can't trap right in the middle of day use areas. And so that's often where we see the squirrels. Now, we don't know if that's just because they come out and hang out and try and beg food from people, or if that's actually where they're the most abundant. But when we're looking for the squirrels, we usually start out just by looking for them, and then we use that as a way to find where we might actually set up live traps to catch them for genetic sampling. So getting the area, sorting out where we're going to trap them, and then also just waiting for them to go in the traps, because sometimes they are absolutely obsessed with peanut butter, which is what we use for bait, and sometimes it seems like they just don't care about peanut butter. They're just busy. They've got busy squirrel lives, and they're doing other things, and they completely ignore our traps. So it's always nice when they catch on that we're trying to give out peanut butter, and they will go into our traps. And usually after they've tasted it in some way, like through going in one of our traps, or we were also setting up trail cameras, and we put out a little bit of peanut butter bait in front of that to get them to come into the trail cameras. Well, it seems like once they actually have figured out what we're using, they're pretty willing to go in the traps because they just love the peanut butter. But before that, they can be really difficult. And they also are quite careful about how they spend their energy. They don't get up early. They go to bed early, so they don't stay up late. And they're only active from about May to August. And even within May, the females might not come out till later in May out of hibernation. The males could go into hibernation as soon as sometime in July. And then the females usually sometime in August. The juveniles might go down sometime in August or early September.
Wow.
But it means that we have very limited time to work with them. And even within the days, they don't seem to be out all day. I feel like a lot of people could really relate to these squirrels.
Yeah, they're sleepers.
They sleep in, they don't stay up late, and they avoid winter by hibernating through it. So they have quite the life.
A little bit depressive creatures. So you kind of mentioned a little bit before, but what is the origin story of your love for squirrels?
Yeah, so I'm a wildlife biologist. I've been working with small animals for most of my career. I started out working on small mammals and birds, did my master's focusing on birds, but then I went to the Yukon and worked with red squirrels for my PhD. And I didn't do that because I was particularly interested in squirrels. That might sound horrible, but I was excited about the Yukon. I was excited about the project 'cause it was a long-term project, which meant it had been going on for quite a long time. There was lots of data, but also opportunity for me to do my own data collection. And so I was really interested in kind of those aspects of the project. And then as soon as I got to the Yukon and started working with squirrels, they just won me over. They just have so much personality, and they make a living in the harshest of places, whether with tree squirrels, that's by even staying awake all winter, or ground squirrels by being smart and going to bed over winter. They're just really good at living in these northern environments that we have here. And so they earned my respect, and I just really enjoyed working with them. So then when I found out that Nature Alberta had started their community science project on the species, I was really excited that I could help a squirrel and try and make sure that species wasn't going to go extinct. Because I also like conservation biology. I teach conservation biology here at MacEwan. My undergrad degree was in forestry, so I've always kind of been thinking about the relationships between humans and how we use resources from the natural world, but how we can do that sustainably. And so this was kind of my chance to be involved in that and maybe to give back to the natural world in some sense.
Oh, that's awesome. Very lovely. What is the big concern with these ground squirrels kind of decreasing in numbers?
Yeah, so with these species, there's a couple reasons we care about them. One, I've been really surprised at how much people love them because where they only live in maybe a dozen places in the province, and most of those places are provincial parks. Potentially because they need the habitat. We are really good at protecting habitat in provincial parks, and that's kind of where they seem to thrive. But it also means that a lot of people see them. They may not know that it's a Franklin's, so they might not be able to identify it. But whenever I would talk to people who work there or talk to campers that are there, or even just when I'm at events and I talk to people who spend time outside, a lot of people really love Franklin's ground squirrels. They're actually very sweet animals. Like, they're not as aggressive as some of the other squirrel species. They, like red squirrels, if you have them in areas where there's humans, they can get quite aggressive trying to steal food, and they can be quite a problem. But the Franklins, I find, are much more polite. They do beg. They actually stand up on their hind legs like a dog and put their and beg for food. But they wouldn't try and steal it out from you. I mean, maybe some other people have had other experiences with them, but everyone that I've talked to, they found them very polite when they're begging. And when you don't feed them, because you shouldn't feed wildlife, they just leave quietly. So for one, these species that help us connect to the natural world are really important because it helps us connect to the natural world, and that is actually beneficial for humans. There have been studies that have shown that people who spend more time outside actually have better mental health. It actually improves your mental health to connect with nature. So having species like this that help people connect are really important. Besides that, they probably have a really important role in their ecosystem. So we don't know much about Franklins. There's been almost nothing studied on them in Alberta. The last study that was published before I started working on them was from the 70s. There have been a few other papers that have mentioned Alberta populations, but no one that's really worked with them hands-on. So we don't totally know their role in the ecosystem, but we can kind of guess based on other squirrels. So gophers, or Richardson's ground squirrels, the ones that people really dislike and like to get rid of because they see them as annoying, those species actually have a really important benefit to their ecosystem. The burrowing that they do actually creates habitat for other species. So species like burrowing owls, which are threatened species, they actually cannot create their own burrows. And so having burrowing species like gophers, Richardson's ground squirrels, around are actually key to having species like that. So I expect that Franklins probably play a similar role. But it's hard for us to know because they've disappeared from so much of the province that we haven't documented their role so far, and we're still kind of relearning about them now that we realize that they're not doing well. So we still have a lot to learn about them, but likely they have some a function in their ecosystem like that. But the other reason we care is that species like this can be used like an indicator species. So an indicator species is a species that indicates that something's going wrong with the ecosystem. And often they're species like Franklin's that are sensitive to changes in their environment and that need that intact habitat to be able to survive. So a species like magpies or Richardson's ground squirrels, the gophers, they're really good at just handling whatever we throw at them. They actually thrive in areas that are human impacted. But something like a Franklin's, if they're disappearing, then that tells us that maybe there's something going on in this ecosystem, and we really should pay attention and try and figure out what's going on and try to bring back some of that habitat. Because if they're disappearing, there's probably a whole bunch of other species that also depend on that habitat that are being impacted, and we're maybe just not realizing because they're not as significantly impacted. Like maybe they're still able to hang on, unlike the Franklins, whereas the Franklins are just so sensitive they disappear. So that's another reason that it's really important to care about Franklins and other species like that, because they tell us when something's happening that we might not notice otherwise until it's too late and we've lost a whole bunch of species. For example, there's a lot of plants that I've noticed Franklin's ground squirrels really like that grouse also really like. So we have few grouse species. The one I see the most in the parkland area is ruffed grouse, and they also need some of those same shrubs that the Franklins seem to be associated with. Now, ruffed grouse seem to be really abundant. You see them in lots of places in the province. But the fact that Franklin's is struggling in some of these areas maybe suggests that actually maybe we could have better habitat for species like ruffed grouse that are maybe seem really common, but probably are also being impacted by human activities.
Wow. As like a public perception, what can the public do?
So
ways to protect
this species. You can really help by submitting observations of any squirrels that you see, even if you don't see Franklin's, because what I'm doing is I'm actually collecting all the observations of squirrels across the province from this app called iNaturalist, which is the app that we use to collect data, and that tells me where people are looking. So I know where people are looking for squirrels. And then I use that to say, okay, well, they're looking for squirrels in all these different places in the province where we actually seeing Franklin's ground squirrels. And then I can use the actual observations of Franklin's ground squirrels from the public. So whether you see a Franklin's or whether you just see a red squirrel or a gray squirrel in your backyard, all of those observations are really useful. So if you go check out the app iNaturalist, that is the app that I use and actually a lot of biologists use because it's a really good resource for us to be able to monitor species and monitor biodiversity. And so that's one great way that you can help out. If you want to learn more about squirrels, like I said earlier, I made a squirrel ID guide. You're welcome to download that. There are some other resources that I'm sure we'll link in the podcast notes that we've created that are about Franklin's ground squirrels and squirrels in general. And then also if you do find yourself in conflict with squirrels or even other wild species, maybe just take a pause before you actually try to get rid of them. Now, I'm not saying that they're never causing problems. Like, I understand there are situations where squirrels do cause damage and there are actual conflicts that we need to deal with. But sometimes it's just kind of a knee-jerk reaction, like, oh, I have a squirrel, I have to get rid of it. If they're really not doing any damage, then maybe just enjoy them. Enjoy having them there, and be thankful that you do have them, because we do have some squirrel species that are not doing well in the province. Use that as your way to connect with nature rather than just saying, oh, it's my backyard, I can't have any wild species in it. And also the thing with squirrels is if you get rid of one, you'll usually get another because they really like empty territories. So they really like to find those empty territories that, you know, if you've removed one squirrel, suddenly you've created perfect real estate for a new squirrel to come in. So if you have if you have one squirrel that is a great neighbor, they never do damage in your yard, they never like get into your shed, like they're just very polite. Maybe keep that squirrel.
You should keep them around. That's hilarious.
Because the next one might not be such a good neighbor.
Interesting. That's funny. We're probably running out of time here, but do you have any advice for any listeners, faculty or students? Any advice at all?
I'd say just one thing that that has been really humbling for me is how this project has just panned out to be something that's really been a perfect project for me and my goals. Get to work with a species I love. I get to travel around Alberta, look at some beautiful places. My students get lots of really great experiences. I talk about this in my classroom. And this was a project that I started because I saw a need in my community. I saw that some, Nature Alberta and naturalists in the community were starting this project and wanted it to get going. But it also was because I was just looking for opportunities. So I know a lot of students can feel like wildlife biology and conservation biology and anything related to the outdoors is a really competitive field, and it can be challenging to get experience, and certainly it is. But just be persistent and really look for opportunities and take opportunities when they come, and it might turn out to be the perfect opportunity for you. Mm-hmm. And then for faculty, if you're doing research that could involve the public, don't shy away from it. It can be intimidating when you're first learning how to talk to people that aren't students or other faculty about your research. I have interesting conversations with people who have squirrel problems and want to shoot all the squirrels in their neighborhood or something like that. But I also have really fun conversations with people, and I've learned a lot from members of the public, and they've inspired different aspects of my research. And that's been a really fun part of this. So if you don't currently do work with the public or any kind of outreach, I would encourage you to give it a try, even if it seems kind of scary to talk to a whole new audience and learn a whole new skill set, because you might be surprised at the kinds of benefits you get from it.
Awesome. Well, thank you for being here. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, good luck on your future research.
Thank you.
Well, that's all we have for today's episode of Research Recasted. If you want to support this podcast, you can visit us at Research Recasted on all your favorite podcast platforms. We upload episodes every 2 weeks. Also, don't forget to check us out on Instagram at Research Recasted, where you can give us a like, leave us a follow, or send us any messages if you have a follow-up question from today's episode. This has been Research Recasted, a knowledge mobilization podcast, brought to you by the Office of Research Services and the Faculty of Fine Arts and Communications at MacEwan University.